My name is Mike Hicks. I work at Ball State University. I'm an economist there. There are a couple of other colleagues out there from Ball State. Hello. Thank you for being here. And my colleague at IU, Jerry Conover, who runs the Indiana Business Research Center, is here also. What we're going to try to do today is talk a little bit about innovation, and hopefully Paul Mitchell will join us. But I'm joined here by two folks, Mark Van Fleet, who is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer for 20 years, a senior executive at U.S. Chamber of Commerce in D.C., where he was the director of export expansion. He's the vice president for Asia, CEO of the ASEAN U.S. Business Council, and a founder of the new International Business Development Unit there. And he's currently a business consultant, senior fellow with the Meridian Institute here in Indy. Hooray. And he's also advisor on global business development to Purdue and other institutions in Indiana. I'm also joined just to my left here by Nick Schultz, who's the DeWitt Wallace Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in D.C. He's a co-author of a recently acclaimed book, From Poverty to Prosperity. At the Institute, he serves as the editor-in-chief of American.com, worth getting onto and reading. That's AEI's online journal of ideas focusing on business, economics, public policy, and affairs. And in 2006, he launched the site and has written its Techno Ideas column. And prior to joining America.com and AEI, he was the editor-in-chief of the web-based TCS Daily and the politics editor of FoxNews.com. He's an award-winning television producer with the PBS series Think Tank. And he's also been published widely in newspapers and magazines, including the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, USA Today, and Slate. And I've been asked to give just a few comments up front, and as an economist, I'm going to try to set the new standard for nerdiness here today. But I do want to thank Maxwell Anderson. I've been listening to arts advocates speak for some time about the importance of arts in economic development. And I believe he's the first one who actually recognized opportunity cost. And so I think he's as eloquently spoken as anyone I have heard, but he also played out the notion that there's not a free lunch with arts funding or doing the things that we're interested in here today. And I commend him for that. I'm not sure that everyone would agree on his choice of opportunities here, but the notion that if you're going to spend more money in the arts, that you have to give up something elsewhere, either economic growth through taxes or spending on professional athletics or something else, is absolutely critical to the debate. And many of the discussion points we saw thus far today maybe haven't recognized that. So I hope that as this report matures and we see what the Meridian Institute has said, we'll get a better sense of what those trade-offs may be. And I think that's a critical part of public policy. And so, sort of to set this up, I want to tell you throughout the morning and afternoon, I'm sitting here as an economist, and equations are zipping through my head, right? And I'm thinking, how do we model the things we've talked about mathematically? How do we account for the value of arts? How do we account for the human capital discussion that we've just had? And what is it that we would use to measure the relative costs of these things to the public sector? Where does the public sector fall into it? And where does the private sector fall into it? So I don't think most of you guys want to hear about that today. You want to hear about what these guys have to say, but I can't get away from that too quick. So I'll just tell you, about 50, 60 years ago, economists had a really good idea of what caused economic growth. And a couple of the guys got a Nobel Prize for it, Robert Solow, for a growth model that predicted that by the mid-1970s or the mid-1980s, poor countries around the world would catch up with rich countries. And by the mid-70s and mid-80s, we realized that that model was wrong. And by the late 80s and early 90s, the model had been supplanted with human capital. And human capital had replaced simply physical capital and labor force as the prime elements of this model. And so there's another growth of these models called endogenous growth theory that included the notions of innovation and the role of innovation institutions into these models. And they have performed enormously well at predicting which countries and which regions inside countries would grow or not grow. And in fact, my own research, which looks at Indiana and other Midwestern states, has looked at U.S. states and metropolitan areas. When we throw in these equations that measure human capital alongside such things as the presence of a water port or proximity to an airport or interstate access or the industrial mix of a community, always the human capital factor dominates these models, not only in the magnitude of explaining economic growth, but so much so that in many places, things that many people here and many traditional economic developers or public policymakers around the country would say are the most important things shrink to insignificance. Roadways, the presence of highways, interstate access, proximity to airports are dwarfed by very elementary measures of the quality of human capital in regions. But what these economic models have done very poorly with is getting down to the nuts and bolts of what that human capital is. We use gross measures of educational attainment, the share of adults with a college degree, or the number of scientists per capita in a metropolitan area. These are very rough metrics. And these rough metrics often turn into policy elements. They turn directly into investments into universities, into foundations focusing on increasing educational attainment of adults. But I don't think that those proxies are really what we're talking about. I think they're only an aspect of them, and I hope that the authors today can lead us into that. But there's one other point I want to make before we go into asking questions, and that is, I'm not a very imaginative guy, right? I'm an economist. So I sit in my office and I run these economic models, and my students and other faculty researchers come in and ask me questions and then close the door behind them, and I get back to work. But in this setting, I wonder, we talk about the pace of change here and what we have to do, and I want to imagine my grandfather, who's a native Hoosier, who came back to Indiana at the end of the First World War to a society that was extremely agricultural. About half of all Hoosiers worked on the farm, and another third of the remainder worked in agricultural processing. And if we were to have convened this model back in 1919 or 1920, and we would be sitting in a museum downtown perhaps, could we have envisioned 40 years from then? Could we have envisioned what the world would be? I think maybe we would have been very nervous about the Indiana economy, the Midwest economy then, because it was just becoming apparent that you could hook an internal combustion engine to that wagon, replace the mule, and the value of labor on a farm was going to go away. And over the next 2 decades, it virtually disappeared. Farmers working traditional farms in Indiana shrank enormously. Maybe a quarter to a half of the population left farms and moved to urban areas. And there's no way that that young man in 1920 could have envisioned that 40 years later his son would be at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab doing what we heard about this morning with radio telemetry and satellites. There's no way that anybody in Indiana sitting in a forum like this would have envisioned that 40 years later. Or if we had reconvened in 1960 or 1970 and thought in the same venue and asked the same questions we're asking today, could we have looked forward to realize that 40 years from now, the great-grandson of that returning soldier in World War I would be in a first-grade classroom in in the Muncie area, tweeting his classroom assignments back to mom and dad. And that's what my 6-year-old does almost every day. And so when I want to ask these guys, after having read what you've written and what you've done, just a few questions about that. And I think I'll start with you, Mark. Can you tell us how you think innovation fits into the global perspective of Indiana? If we look at Indiana as a place that aspires to a global reach, what does innovation mean to you, and what does it mean in that global environment, and what's your prognosis on that?
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with distinguished panelists here, that's for sure. I think that, innovation has to have, in many ways, a global dimension. We've talked about it. Deborah Wynn-Smith, I think, hit it right on the button when she said we are now in a globalized digital economy. These trends are increasingly international. So from a certain point of view, unless we innovate, we're going to be buried by international competition. The waves of change are accelerating because of international competition. On the other hand, I would say that the way to meet that challenge is to go more proactively international. And it's not a matter of low-cost, high-assembly, low-skilled jobs in China anymore. It's a matter, as Deborah said, of innovation now is globalized, and the generation of new knowledge is now global. So how does Indiana place itself in that context? And when you look at how Indiana is doing, on the export side, we're doing quite well from the macro numbers. If you look at the numbers, in fact, in the first half of this year, Indiana's exports are up 37% if you take a snapshot of last first 2 quarters in 2010. So we're doing better in macro terms when you look at who is exporting, and the average in the United States for those companies who are exporting that are smaller companies, under 500 employees, is about 30%. So the average in the United States is 30% of your exporters are small and mid-sized companies. In Indiana, it's half that. So the question is, Indiana is dominated by bigger exporters. And can we look at trying to help the mid-sized companies go global? When our economy is stagnant, and many economists look to this 2% growth or less over the next 2 years, but yet you have China, India, Southeast Asia growing at 8, 9, 10%. We as a state, as economies, have to start plugging into that growth. So on the export side, we have to do a better job, and we can get back to how to do that. On the foreign direct investment side, we continue to be very successful in bringing larger companies, mostly manufacturing companies, into this state. And we've been very successful at getting companies from places like Japan, because we had visionary leadership under Governor Orr, who said we need to have an office in Japan that focuses on building relationships that will lead to the Subaru factories of the future. Here we do. We have the Subaru, Toyota, et cetera. What I don't see that we're doing is bringing the new, innovative, high-tech, smaller companies from around the world and bringing them here to Indiana, the economies of the future that we talked about in the whole other part of our program here. So when you look at what does Indiana have to bring these innovative companies here, I think you have to look at the jewels in the crown, which is the universities. The big research universities here are world-class. They have assets that could bring many more companies here to Indiana. And it's my contention that there's a way to harness these in a more proactive and systematic way, which we can get into later in the discussion.